Good afternoon, everybody. Hope everybody is having a good week. And today we're going to take a little bit of time and reflect some more on Paul's letter to the Philippians. As we've been saying, this is a letter that Paul wrote during a challenging time. It's a time when he was under house arrest, a time when he was cut off and separated from a lot of the things that he wanted to do, but maybe even more significantly, he was cut off and separated from a lot of the people who meant so much to him. And so he puts his thoughts into this letter. He pours his heart into this letter, and over the course of just 4 brief chapters, he shares with the church at Philippi an enormous amount of insight, an enormous amount of wisdom, but also just his personal struggles, his personal perspective on some of the things that he was going through. So today we're going to look at a brief passage from the final chapter of this letter. It's Philippians chapter 4, verses 10 through 13. Again, like so much in this book, there are likely thoughts here, there are likely words here that you've encountered before. These are some of Paul's most quoted writings. These are some of Paul's most quoted words for good reason. And they're words that can resonate with us maybe in a particular way, a particularly significant way during this time. So let's look briefly at Philippians 4, verses 10 through 13. Writing to the Philippians, Paul says, "I rejoiced greatly in the Lord that at last you renewed your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned, but you had no opportunity to show it. I am not saying this because I am in need, for I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do all this through him who gives me strength." So just from the opening couple of verses of this passage, we see one of the things that Paul is struggling with, one of the things that he's been struggling with throughout this letter, and that's the fact that he can't have that personal contact with the Philippians that he longs for. He talks about the fact that they have renewed their concern for him. He's heard about the fact that this church that he loves, this church of people he cares about, are caring about him as well. They're praying for him. They're compassionately suffering with him through his hardship. They are feeling concerned because of the situation he's in, and that makes an enormous difference to Paul. As we all understand, when we're going through a hard time, sometimes just knowing that there are people out there who care about us, sometimes knowing that there are people out there who are thinking about us and praying for us, makes all the difference in the world. And so when Paul has received this word, when he's heard that the Philippians are caring about him, it's one more thing for him to rejoice over. Even though they're separated from one another, even though he can't be there with them, even though he can't hug them in person, even though he can't be in the same room with them, he knows that he is not out of their mind. He is on their mind. He is on their hearts, and this is something he takes great comfort in. And it's this middle section into verses 11 through really 11 and 12 onto verse 13 that maybe we've heard, we've encountered before, and that can resonate with us in such a powerful way, where Paul is talking about what it means to be content. This is a word that we encounter a lot in Paul's writings. Paul is someone who talks a fair amount about contentment. And I think that sometimes we can look at the situation of someone like Paul, writing these things, writing about what it means to be content, even in the midst of his hardships, even in the midst of his suffering, even in the midst of his house arrest and his imprisonment at times, and his beatings and his shipwrecks, and the different things, different trials he had to go through, the different tests he had to face. And we look at him saying that he has learned to be content whatever the circumstances. And I think maybe the temptation is to see that as something superhuman. But the amazing thing about contentment is it's something that God desires for all of us. A lack of contentment, in fact, could maybe be understood to be the root of a lot of our sinful behavior, really the root of the condition of sin. If we look all the way back to the book of Genesis, What is it that led Adam and Eve into that first sin? It's not having something that they desired. They had everything they needed. They could eat from every tree in the garden, but there was this one tree that they weren't supposed to eat from. And once that idea got planted in their head, it was hard for them to be content with all the good things they did have. And so they desired more than what God had given them. They reached out and took what God had not offered to them. And we can see that that's sort of the root of so much of our sinful behavior, a grasping at something that we were never meant to have, whether it's the fulfillment of some desire or some ambition that we have. It's a lack of contentment that can lead us to make decisions that hurt others and that ultimately hurt ourselves and that sever our relationship with God. And so when Paul talks about being content here, there's a really significant aspect of that our relationship with God, our relationship to others, is in some ways bound up with our ability or our inability to be content. But there's also a really simple reality at work here. The fact that contentment, the potential to be content with what we have, isn't a superhuman strength. In fact, most of the time it unfolds in some of the simplest of ways. For Paul, maybe it meant looking at the things, the strength that God was giving him, even in the midst of his imprisonment. For us, it's going to look different, right? It's going to be about looking at every day, looking at every opportunity we have each day, looking at the people around us, looking at the things that we see in our lives that are good, maybe even in the midst of a lot of struggles, and learning what it means to embrace those things, learning what it means, as Paul has said earlier, to rejoice in those things. And so during this time, as maybe we've had a lot of things taken away from us, our plans, our normal routines, maybe some relationships are under strain because of not being able to have that face-to-face time that we long to have with people. Maybe the ways we normally work, the ways we normally carry out our business have been interrupted. There's so much that we can look at and lament. But I think that one of the biggest challenges and one of the most productive things we can do, one of the most fruitful things we can do during this time, is to look for the opportunity to be content, to look for the big and small ways, the big and small realities in our lives where we see God at work, where we see God's goodness at work, to look at the people in our lives whom God has given us, whom God has placed in our lives that they might help sustain us, and to look at the opportunities we have to serve God, even in the midst of challenges, even in the midst of trials. The secret to godly contentment is that we will never be more content than when we recognize that God has given us what we need to be the people he has called us to be. That all of the things that God calls us to face, he gives us the strength to do so. All of the challenges God calls us to carry out, he equips us with the gifts we need to do so. That's where contentment comes from. This recognition that there is nothing that we face, there is nothing that we will be called upon to do that God has not equipped us for. Sometimes we have to squint to see it. Sometimes we maybe have to wrestle with it a little bit. But the contentment that Paul talks about comes from that recognition. So this week, whatever you might be facing, whatever challenges, whatever frustrations, whatever obstacles you might be facing, let's also look at the opportunities we have to serve, the opportunities we have to give, the things that God has equipped us with, that we might be the people he has called us to be, and do the work that he has called us to do, because that is the secret to the kind of contentment that Paul talks about here. So I hope everybody has a wonderful week, and I hope to talk to you again soon.